His hands were shaking, but not with fear. With fury. "Walk faster," he growled, yanking my arm as we approached the edge of the creek. Then, without warning, he shoved me forward. My heel caught on a rock. I stumbled, arms flailing. "You think I won't do it?" he hissed. "No one will find you here." The water below churned, dark and cold. Why would the boy I raised with bedtime prayers and scraped knees want me dead? And what had I done to deserve being thrown away like this? If you want to know what happens next, stay with me until the end of the video. And if you still believe deep in your heart that God is always watching over you, silently arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment saying AMEN below this video, because who knows, at the very moment you write those words, a blessing may quietly enter your life. I have lived long enough to know the sounds a creek makes when it is glad and when it is angry. The little stream behind the old sycamores in Asheville used to laugh for me, a quick, bright chatter that sounded like children skipping rocks after Sunday service. Lately, though, its voice has changed. It drags over stones with a low, sorrowful pull, like a woman sweeping after dark, careful not to wake the house. Maybe I am hearing my own heart in it. Maybe the water is warning me. Either way, I listen. My name is Margaret Collins, but folks call me Maggie. I have worked most of my life with my hands. In the mill, when the looms still sang through those long Carolina summers. Later, at the church kitchen, stirring pots and cutting pies for funerals and Wednesdays. My palms are the kind that cannot hide their stories. They remember thread burn and hot skillet handles and the feel of a feverish child pressed against my chest, all ribs and need. That child grew into a man with shoulders broader than his father's and a grin that used to light up a dugout. My son, Daniel Danny, when he was little, came to me like a promise I made to God and tried my best to keep. When my husband passed, I told myself I would not ask for much from the world, only a roof that did not leak, a garden that could carry us through winter, and a boy who believed there was goodness in him. I held to that. I packed lunches, paid bills, and said no to kindnesses I could not afford. I also did a thing the bank lady told me was sensible. I took out a life insurance policy, small by city standards, big enough for me. I used to think of it like a last casserole delivered to my son's doorstep when I no longer could cook. That is how mothers think. We plan for our children's hunger even after we are gone. As leaves turned this year, the air changed in the house. It was not a storm you could point to on a radar or a crack in the ceiling you could spackle. It was quieter than that, a space that grew between me and my boy. He still kissed my cheek in the morning, but his eyes were somewhere past my shoulder, restless. He was out late, came back with his jaw tight and his voice courteous to the point of brittle. I have seen men try to carry trouble like a secret and watch that trouble leak through their shirt like sweat anyway. I started hearing the creak at night. Helen Brooks noticed first. Helen sits 3 pews ahead of me at St. Mary's and knows every casserole dish in the county by its chips and handles. She placed a warm roll in my hand after service and asked, as soft as a prayer, "Maggie, is your boy all right?" I said what mothers say. "He is tired. Work is thin. It will pass." Helen looked at me, and I looked at the hymn numbers posted on the wall. Later, she walked with me to the corner, her arm looped in mine, and said there is a man in town who lends money where he should not, a man who smiles like an empty plate. She said his name, and the creak in my chest dragged over stones. I tried to keep supper gentle and simple. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans that still had a snap. Danny chewed like a man who forgot how to taste. He thanked me, too loud. He washed his plate with the kind of energy a person gets from fear. I asked if he had seen the school's baseball coach, the one who used to call him a natural. Maybe he could help find some work. Danny said he did not need help and that everything was fine. That word, fine, can hide a mountain of hurt. In the late afternoon, with the sun coming low and sweet through the pines, he stood in the doorway and asked if I wanted to walk down to the creek, the one that runs behind the sycamore lot. We have walked there 100 times, back when his legs were little and the world was wide open. I remember him throwing a stick in the current and racing it to the bend, bare knees flashing. I said yes, because that is what I say to him when I can. We followed the path where the leaves tumbled like old letters. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke from somewhere far off. Danny told me about a friend who might have a new job lined up. He told me about the high school's harvest festival next week, how there would be music, how I should come. He spoke in future tense, like a man setting a table in a house he may not own. I watched his hands. Those hands used to hold frogs and foul balls and my fingers when we crossed Main Street. Now they made tight little fists and opened again, then slid into his jacket pockets as if to keep from saying too much. At the old footbridge, the planks creaked in their familiar way. A pair of crows lifted off the wire and shouted about it. The creek was darker than usual, catching the sky in crooked pieces. I set my palm on the rail, and the wood felt damp and soft, like something that had been wept upon. He stepped beside me, close. I could smell that bar soap clean of him under the sour edge of worry. He pointed downstream and asked if I remembered the time he fell in and came up hollering, half proud, half scared. Of course I remembered. I remember everything about him. I laughed, and it sounded almost like my old laugh. I am not a woman who borrows trouble from tomorrow. But there, with the water talking low and the light thinning, I felt a hush run through me that was nothing like peace. It was the hush a house knows an instant before a plate slips and breaks. I heard Helen's voice again, the one she uses when she prays for the sick. I heard the bank lady's careful tone, explaining beneficiaries and signatures in a room that smelled of toner and new envelopes. I heard the part of myself that is made of bone and stubbornness asking, "Why does your boy keep glancing at the rail?" Danny said my name, soft. "Mama, it is a word that can carry a man right back to his first breath." He took my elbow the way you do when you help someone step over a root. There was nothing but kindness in the motion, except for the way his fingers tightened, then eased, then tightened again. The creek dragged. A chill climbed my back as if the water had reached up and touched me. I looked at my son's face and saw a war there, love on one side, fear on the other, and something else behind them that did not belong to him at all. I wanted to take his face in my hands and tell him that I know how a person can get lost and still be found. He said, "Let's go a bit farther," and I nodded because I have always followed him as far as I could. The path narrowed, and the bank leaned toward the current like a tired shoulder. The world felt balanced on the edge of a decision. Even the crows fell quiet. I told myself to mark every detail, the grain of the wood beneath my palm, the weight of his hand on my sleeve, the exact way the water lifted around a stone because a life can turn on a small thing, and a mother knows when she is standing in the doorway of a moment she will never forget. I do not remember ever feeling the cold so sharply, my breath a mist hanging between us, and the creek beneath making its steady, unkind promise. Danny had guided me past the bridge to a bend I had always thought sweet. The water smooth, shallow, kissing stones rather than pulling them under. Now, the current looked hungry, and the banks leaned too abruptly, the soil soft as bread. Every memory I had of childhood laughter and his small, strong hands came rushing back, and I pressed my palm against the railing to steady the tremor that ran through me. "Mom?" Danny's voice was hollow. Not the boy, not the Little League coach, not the young man reassuring me about a job and the festival. That voice carried something else, something broken. I turned toward him, and for a moment, I saw the son I raised alone after the mill's shift lights turned off, and the hush of the empty kitchen took over. He had been my entire world. I remember cradling him when his fever burned high, singing old hymns I'd known by heart since childhood until he slept. But time has a way of unraveling things we hold tight, and I had felt the unraveling lately, like a loose thread in a quilt. His jaw was too tight, too deliberate. He stepped close, and his breath smelled faintly of kerosene and late-night bars. He stopped. His hand brushed my arm in a gesture made both to steady and to control. Suddenly I realized, without thinking, that I was holding my breath. The world narrowed to his hand, my rail, the edge of the bank, and the liquid drag of water beneath. "Maggie," he said again. The syllables were sharp, unsure. "You just please. Be easy." And then, without warning, he released the rail, and with a movement like something practiced too many times, he gave me a push. Instinct and fear stirred together. I tensed, but the ground leaned against me. My foot slipped in the worn leather of my shoe, and I went down, knee first, then sliding. For a second, the chill of fear froze me. I thought, I am going to die, right here. But something snapped in me. A primal sort of magnetism, One hand reached for anything unsteady, and it found a root. The other loaded the world into a grip. Water splashed my face, cold and indignant. I gasped, pulling at the root as the world tipped. The water dragged, and for a moment, I thought I saw myself in the river. A woman submerged, peaceful as she was gone. But then the root snapped me back. I tore upward, dragging my weight, pushing my fingers into earth-grown hands until I found footing. Danny was there, bent forward, his face a blur of fear and regret, and something darker I could not name. My skirt was wet, my arm bruised against the wood, my heart pounding in a way that erased decades. I did not scream. The father I lost years ago had always said, "A colonnaise doesn't raise a racket just so folks would hush up." I did not speak. I watched. He reached out, whisper-voiced, "Mom, I'm sorry." His palms were empty, his eyes wide, shimmering with guilt like a candle in water. He wanted something maybe to be forgiven, maybe just to hear that I still loved him, but I couldn't speak. The air between us was thick, and I pressed my free hand against the railing for support, feeling its damp weight, feeling how the wind pushed through my hair like a blade. The river snarled at my back. He helped me up, shame and relief fighting on his face. I let him. When the ground rose beneath me, I pulled myself up slowly, refusing to look into his eyes until my breathing smoothed. I felt odd, disconnected from my own body. We stood there for a long time. Finally, I said, "Danny, what were you thinking?" The words were steady, but my heart hammered loud as a train whistle. I felt like a girl again, afraid of storms she didn't understand. He swallowed. "I'm sorry." He said it like a mantra, hoping repetition would wash him clean. I thought you'd be gone soon, and then I wouldn't have to pay it back. The insurance money." His voice cracked, and he cupped his face in his hands. I felt my heart splinter. Not that they were just words. They showed he betrayed me. He weighed my life against debts. But I must not fall into the abyss of anger now. I had to keep hold of myself, of us, of the truth. I stood tall, as much as the shaking in my legs allowed. "Look at me," I said. He looked. We were close enough to hear the creak gobble stones. I said, "You thought I'd be gone soon. You thought money mattered more than someone's life. Do you understand so little what being my son means?" Tears ran down his face. He dropped his hands and lurched forward, as if to catch the river with a glance. I thought he might fall in, but he only swayed. I had choices. I could let him go then, leave him there, unheard, haunted. But I thought of God's mercy, Helen's prayers, the glass of milk I used to sneak him after midnight when he got upset about a lost glove or school bully. Being a mother does not end at betrayal. Being a parent means you love when hurting is the only reason to stay. I put my hand on his shoulder. The bridge creaked under both our weights. "We will talk," I said, voice trembling and sure. "We will make this right." He nodded, shaking. "I'll fix it. I'll pay back. I swear." "I know," I whispered. "We'll find a way." I reached for the rail. It felt like a lifeline, the rough grain of it grounding me in the actual world. The one I still had to live in. The one I still mattered in. Behind us, the creek softened into its old voice. It wasn't laughing yet, but maybe I could teach it how. The walk back from the creek felt longer than it ever had before. Danny walked behind me, head low, footsteps soft like he didn't want to wake the guilt that hung between us. My body ached, but the deeper bruises weren't on my arms or knees. They were lodged somewhere in the tender space behind my ribs, where memory and love make their home. I didn't say a word for most of the walk. Not because I didn't have things to say, but because I feared the wrong words would break everything beyond repair. The late autumn sun slipped behind the ridge, painting the sky a tired gray. Shadows lengthened across the ground, like fingers reaching for something already gone. By the time we reached the back porch, my hands were trembling from more than the cold. I sat down on the top step and folded my arms tight around myself. Danny hovered, unsure. "Mom, do you want me to make you some tea?" I looked up at him. His face was pale, haunted. I couldn't remember the last time he'd looked so much like a boy, not since the day he came home from school with a broken nose and refused to say who hit him, too proud or too ashamed. That same stubborn fear now curled around him like smoke. I nodded. He disappeared into the house, and I heard the clink of the kettle on the stove, the tap running. It was strange how normal it all sounded, like any other night. But the normalcy was a lie now, thin as eggshell. I sat still, letting the chill settle around me. The porch boards creaked under me. From here, I could see the edge of the woods, the path we had taken so many times before. I knew I'd never walk it again the same way. When Danny returned, he handed me a chipped blue mug and sat beside me. He didn't speak right away, and neither did I. We sat in silence long enough to hear the kettle hiss from the burner he'd forgotten to turn off. He didn't move to get it. "Why didn't you scream?" he asked, finally. I sipped the tea. It was too hot, bitter with oversteeped leaves, but I drank it anyway. Would it have mattered? He flinched. I looked out at the trees, the bare branches tangled like questions. "I didn't scream," I said slowly, "because I didn't want the world to know. Not yet. I needed to understand what my son had become first." Danny groaned, covering his face again. "I'm not a monster, Mom. I wasn't going to really, I panicked. I thought I could scare you, make it look like an accident. I wasn't thinking." I set the mug down. "You were thinking. You were thinking a lot. About debt. About desperation. About my signature on that insurance policy." I paused. "You weighed my life, Danny. You measured it in dollars." He started to cry, then soft, ugly sobs that sounded like they'd been waiting a long time to get out. I let him. I didn't comfort him, not yet. I needed to sit with my own pain first. "I lost the shop," he choked out. "I lied to you. It's gone. I owe $28,000 to a man named Blake who doesn't wait long before collecting. I tried. God knows I tried. But everything I touched this year went bad, and then I saw that policy in your drawer. It felt like a way out." I closed my eyes. The weight of his words pressed against me like the earth itself. All those weeks, I'd watched him come home late, take calls on the porch, turn cold. I thought he was tired. I thought he needed rest, support. I never imagined this. "I should call the police," I said quietly. He froze. "I know," he whispered. "I wouldn't blame you." I looked at him long and hard. "But I won't. Not tonight." His breath caught. "I need time to think, to pray, and you." I turned to face him, my eyes steady. "You need to tell Helen. Tomorrow. I want her to know everything. And after that, we're going to talk to Sheriff Harris. I won't lie for you. If he asks, I'll tell the truth. But if you go to him first, before it becomes a mess, we might still have a sliver of grace left." He nodded slowly. "Okay, I will. First thing in the morning." I picked up the mug again, the tea now cold. "You will sleep in the guest room. I don't want to wake up tonight and find you pacing the hallway. Lock your door if it makes you feel better. I'll be fine." The wind picked up, stirring the dry leaves across the porch. I listened to them scratch against the floorboards, small, restless things that refused to settle. Inside, the house was too quiet. I lit a candle on the kitchen table, not for light but for comfort. I sat in my chair, the one with the creaky leg that Danny used to call the thinking throne, and let the silence wrap around me. I thought of calling Helen then, but I couldn't bear to speak just yet. The words were still settling, still arranging themselves in my heart. Instead, I opened my Bible, the one with Danny's birth certificate tucked inside, and read from Psalms. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." The next morning came too fast. I didn't sleep. I sat and watched the sun rise over the ridge, the sky cracked open with orange and lavender. Danny came into the kitchen, eyes red, face drawn. He looked like a man who had walked through fire and wasn't sure if he'd made it out yet. He nodded once and left without a word. I watched from the window as he got in his truck and drove toward town. I didn't know what he'd say to Helen or if he'd truly confess, but I knew something had shifted. Later that morning, Helen called. Her voice was calm, but I could tell she knew. "He told me, Maggie," she said. "He told me everything." I closed my eyes. "And?" "He's scared, but he's willing to face it. Sheriff Harris will speak with him tomorrow." "Thank you, Helen." We hung up, and I felt something relief maybe, or sorrow wrapped in hope. I didn't know yet how the story would end, but for the first time in days, I felt like I had a thread to follow. It wasn't much, but it was something. I went to the back porch again, tea in hand, and listened to the creek. Today, it sounded different. Not quite laughing, but not angry either. Just moving. Forward. That morning after Helen's call, I found myself moving through the house like a woman walking through the memory of her own life. Every item I touched seemed to hold a voice. Danny's drawings still taped to the pantry door, the dented saucepan he once used to catch fireflies, even the old Afghan tossed over the armchair that still held the faint scent of eucalyptus and winter nights. I ran my fingers across the frame of a photo near the hallway, the three of us, long ago. James, my late husband, strong and square-shouldered, holding our son in his lap like he was a fragile piece of good news. Danny must have been about 7 then, grinning wide, gap-toothed, one sock pulled higher than the other. My own face was caught mid-laugh, looking off to the side, probably at something silly they'd said. There had been such warmth between us then. That photo used to comfort me. Now it felt like a riddle. How did we come so far from that? The rest of the day passed like a church bell in thick fog, faint, constant, distant. Danny stayed gone most of the day. I didn't ask where. I knew he needed time, and maybe distance. I needed space, too, to figure out what forgiveness should look like when it was earned instead of assumed. I tried to busy myself. I baked something I hadn't done in a while. Apple bread, the kind with cinnamon and a brown sugar crust. I didn't make it for Danny. I made it for myself. There is something healing in the kneading, in the slow sifting of flour, in the quiet discipline of waiting for something to rise. As I pulled the loaves from the oven, the smell filled the kitchen, warm and spicy and alive. It reminded me of December's past, of Danny coming home from practice and grabbing a slice before I could even set it down. I couldn't help it. I set one of the loaves aside on a plate, maybe for him, maybe for memory. Late in the afternoon, the phone rang. It was Sheriff Tom Harris. "Miss Collins," he began, his voice low and respectful. "Your son came in today." I held the phone steady, though my heart was racing. He told me the truth, or at least enough of it to break a man in half. I listened, and I believed him. Mostly because I've known that boy since he was running around St. Mary's in Sunday slacks and scuffed shoes. And I believe you raised him right, even if life pushed him sideways. End of course. I swallowed, unsure of what to say. "He's scared, ma'am." But he didn't try to hide. He told me about the debt, about the creek, about you. I closed my eyes. "I'm not going to charge him," Sheriff Harris said. "Not yet, but we're going to put him in a restitution program. He'll work, repay the community, and most importantly, he's agreed to counseling. Mandatory." I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. "And he's moving out," the sheriff added gently. "He said you asked him to give you space." I nodded, though he couldn't see it. "Thank you, Tom." "No, ma'am, thank you, for not letting this story end where it started." When I hung up, I sat for a while in the quiet, hands folded in my lap. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed. Slow, deep, present. That night, Danny returned home just after dark. He didn't come inside. I heard his truck pull into the gravel drive, then shut off. After a moment, I stepped onto the porch. He was standing beside the truck, looking unsure, a duffel bag at his feet. "I'm heading over to stay at Mike's for a while," he said. "The old place out near Route 7. He's got a spare room, said I could help fix up the barn." I nodded. "I know I've got a lot to make right," he continued, eyes on the gravel. "But I wanted to say goodbye properly. Not like last time." I stepped down to him, the porch light casting shadows over the yard. The air smelled like pine and distant wood smoke. "I made apple bread," I said softly. He looked up, surprised. "You did?" I handed him a small wrapped loaf. "It's not forgiveness, but it's a start." He took it like it was breakable. His eyes were glassy, full of a gratitude he didn't know how to express. "Thank you, Mom." "Don't thank me," I said, voice steady. "Earn it." He nodded. Then, almost as an afterthought, he stepped forward and hugged me tightly, fiercely, like he remembered what it meant to hold on to someone. I held him too, just for a moment, long enough to remember the baby I once carried, the boy I once fed, the man I hoped he could still become. When he pulled away, he didn't speak again. He simply picked up his bag, climbed into his truck, and drove off into the darkness. I stood in the gravel, arms crossed against the chill, watching until his taillights disappeared around the bend. That night, I couldn't sleep. So I sat at the kitchen table, candle burning low, and wrote a letter. Not to Danny, to myself. Dear Maggie, you did not raise a perfect son, but you did raise a man who can still choose to change. You are not broken. You are bruised, yes, but still here, still standing. You chose love, even when love hurt. You chose truth, even when silence would have been easier. Hold your head high. You are not just a mother, you are a survivor. And tomorrow, you will bake again. Not for forgiveness, not for grief, but for healing. Because you deserve it too. M. When I finished writing, I folded the letter and tucked it under the teapot, where I would find it again when the morning came. Outside, the creek kept moving, and so would I. The days that followed felt like walking through fog. I moved through the house, touching surfaces, adjusting things that didn't need adjusting. The curtains in the den, the spice rack in the kitchen, the framed photographs on the wall that had hung in the same place for more than 20 years. It was as if I needed to remind myself that I still had control over something. The silence was louder now. Not heavy, but wide, like a church between services. Daniel didn't call. I didn't expect him to. I had made it clear that I needed time, space to breathe without fear or guilt hanging over every breath. But still, each time the phone rang, a piece of me hoped. The mornings were hardest. Not because I missed him, though I did, but because mornings were when I'd hear his footsteps on the stairs, the sound of the fridge opening, the hum of him just being near. Now, the house echoed differently. More honest, maybe, but still empty. Helen stopped by a few days later, unannounced as always. She brought 2 loaves of bread, her famous cranberry walnut, and a pot of chicken stew that still steamed through the foil lid. I figured you weren't eating enough, she said, not looking at me as she set things on the counter. That or you were living on coffee and regrets. I smiled at that, because it was exactly right. We sat at the kitchen table, the late afternoon sun pouring through the window like melted gold. I told her everything, or almost everything. She didn't need the sharp edges, just the shape of the wound. Helen listened the way good friends do. Not interrupting, not judging, just nodding slowly, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, eyes soft but unyielding. He's in the program, I said quietly. Sheriff Harris says he shows up early, stays late. He's helping rebuild the town gazebo, hammering new boards over old mistakes. Helen raised an eyebrow. That's a start. It's more than I expected, I said. She tilted her head. You believe he can change? I thought about it, really thought, then nodded. Yes, but I also believe he has to want it more than I do. This time, I'm not carrying the whole load. Helen reached across the table, squeezing my hand. That's the Maggie I know. Later that evening, after she left, I went to the attic for the first time in years. I don't know what pulled me up there, some gentle tug of memory maybe. The ladder creaked, and dust danced in the flashlight's beam like bits of history. I found old boxes marked with faded black ink. Danny, kindergarten, James, army stuff, wedding. I sat down on the old trunk that once belonged to my grandmother and opened the one marked letters. Inside were pieces of myself. I'd forgotten notes from James when he was deployed, birthday cards from my sisters in Georgia, church bulletins with Danny's name scribbled next to the children's choir list. But what caught my breath was a sealed envelope addressed in my own handwriting. To Maggie when you forget who you are. I stared at it for a long time. Then, hands trembling slightly, I opened it. Dear Maggie, if you're reading this, it means you've lost something big. Maybe your marriage. Maybe your faith. Maybe your child's trust. Maybe even your own. But here's what you must remember. You are not what you've lost. You are what you've lived through. You've fed a child from your hands and rocked him through fever dreams. You've loved a man through silence and storm. You've worked jobs that bent your back and still sang in church on Sundays. You've made something out of almost nothing, and you've never asked for praise. You forget sometimes, but you're strong. Not in the loud way, in the quiet way that lasts longer. So cry if you need, sit down if you must. But don't stay there too long. Get up, Maggie. Get up and remember who you are. I didn't remember writing it. Maybe during one of those long winters after James died. Or maybe after a particularly hard year when Danny pulled away from me. And I didn't know why. But it found me now, just when I needed it most. I stayed up there for hours, reading old letters, running fingers over the worn edges of my life. And when I finally came down, the air in the house felt different. Not lighter exactly, but more mine. In the days that followed, I began to do things I hadn't done in years. I started walking every morning, not just to the mailbox, but down past the sycamores, up the ridge road where the view opened into hills and fog. I brought a small notebook and began jotting thoughts, not full pages, just little phrases, tiny snapshots of memory and hope. One morning, about 2 weeks after Danny had left, I passed by the town gazebo and saw him. He was crouched low, hammer in hand, his shirt damp with sweat, a bandana tied around his neck. He didn't see me, or maybe he did and chose not to wave. Either way, I didn't stop. I just watched him for a moment, watching the way he worked, focused and slow. That was enough for now. That night, I sat on the porch again, wrapped in a shawl James gave me on our 10th anniversary. The creek murmured in the dark, its voice no longer angry, no longer warning. Just present. Moving. Like me, I thought of writing Danny a letter. Not a long one, just a note to say, "I saw you today. You looked like someone building something that might last." But I didn't send it. Not yet. Some things need time, and I was finally learning how to give it. The first Saturday of December brought with it a peculiar kind of brightness, the kind that shows up after a week of heavy clouds, making the world look washed clean, as if forgiveness itself had rained down in the night. I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee cradled in both hands, watching the golden light play across the hills. The frost was still clinging to the grass, silvering the lawn like dust from an old hymn book. The creek down behind the trees murmured softly, a sound so familiar now it felt like part of my pulse. It had been nearly 3 weeks since Danny moved out. In that time, I had taken small steps toward myself, baking again, walking longer, saying yes when Helen invited me to Thursday night Bible group instead of making excuses about being tired. It was during one of those meetings that something unexpected happened. Helen and I were standing near the back of the church hall, sipping coffee from styrofoam cups that always made everything taste a little like plastic, when Pastor Glenn made an announcement. "We're looking for volunteers," he said, voice gentle but sure, "to help with a new mentorship program for at-risk youth in town. Nothing fancy, just someone to show up once a week, share a meal, listen, maybe teach a skill or two." I felt Helen glance at me. I stared down into my coffee like it held a message. Then, before I could stop myself, I raised my hand. "I can cook," I said, "and listen." The next week, I met my match. Her name was Laney, 16, sharp-eyed, and quieter than snowfall. Her file said she'd been in and out of foster care since she was 6. No stable adults, no roots. She showed up to our first dinner wearing a jacket too thin for the cold and a look that dared me to lie to her. I made pot roast. She ate in silence. Halfway through the second helping, she asked, "You got kids?" I didn't flinch. "I have a son." "Where is he?" I paused. "Trying to find his way back." "Oh." Laney didn't say anything else. But when she left, she took a slice of pie wrapped in foil without being asked. That was something. Over the weeks, Laney began opening up in the smallest ways. She'd ask about the recipes I used. She'd help chop vegetables without being told. One night, as we washed dishes side by side, she asked, "Did your kid ever mess up bad?" I looked at her and said, "Worse than most people know, but I still love him." She didn't respond right away. But later, as she put on her jacket, she said, "Thanks for not pretending he was perfect." It was the highest compliment I'd received in years. One snowy afternoon, about a month after we first met, Laney showed up with a tiny potted plant. "I know it's dumb," she muttered, handing it to me like it might explode. "They said we should bring a thank you gift. This is the only thing that didn't feel fake." It was a peace lily. Small, delicate, but strong. "I love it," I said. And I meant it. That night, I set it on the windowsill by the kitchen sink, where it would get the best light. It made the whole room feel more alive. It was that same evening, just after dinner, when there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Danny. He looked different, leaner somehow, like life had scraped away some of the heaviness he'd carried. He held his cap in his hands, eyes unsure. "I can come back later," he said. "No," I replied. "You're here now, M." He stepped inside slowly, like a man visiting a place he once loved but wasn't sure still belonged to him. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where so much had happened and so much had been left unsaid. I poured us both tea. He looked around at the space like he was trying to memorize it. "You've redecorated," he said, nodding toward the plant. "That's Laney's doing," I replied. "A girl I mentor. She's teaching me things I forgot I knew." He smiled faintly. "That's good." We sat in silence a while. Then he said, "I've been sober 30 days. I looked at him, not at the words, but the weight behind them. "That's worth saying out loud," I said, "and worth continuing." "I came to tell you something," he said, setting his tea down. "I talked to Blake, paid off what I could. Sheriff Harris is helping me set up a payment plan for the rest." "That's a start," I said. He nodded, then added, "I'm not asking to come back. I know better than that. But I wanted you to know. I'm not running anymore." I leaned back in my chair, watching him. He looked like a man beginning again, not healed, but healing. "I'm proud of you," I said quietly. He blinked, surprised. "Really?" I nodded. "Because you showed up, because you're staying steady, and because for once, I think you understand that love and money don't weigh the same." He laughed a little, then grew quiet. "I still think about that day," he said. "I do too," I replied. "I wish I could erase it." "You can't," I said gently, "but you can outgrow it." We sat a while longer, talked about small things, the gazebo, the winter forecast, the pot roast recipe he missed. Before he left, I gave him a slice of apple bread. He took it like he'd been handed something sacred. "Happy early Christmas," he said. "You too." After he left, I stood at the window and watched him walk down the path. His steps weren't hurried. They were calm, purposeful. When I turned back to the kitchen, I looked at the peace lily. It had begun to bloom. It's a strange thing to realize your life isn't over just because the hardest part didn't kill you. I had spent so many years wrapped up in what came next: Danny's grades, Danny's first job, Danny's heartbreaks and mistakes, that I forgot what it felt like to wake up and wonder what I wanted. Not in a selfish way, but in a way that allowed me to feel curious again. It began with music. One morning, after Laney had left and I was scrubbing out the cast-iron skillet, I turned on the old radio tucked beneath the spice rack. I hadn't touched it in years. The dial was stiff, the station a little fuzzy. But then, through the static, came a song I hadn't heard since before James passed. It was a waltz, slow, golden, full of the kind of ache that settles in your bones and makes you grateful for it. Without thinking, I wiped my hands on a dish towel, stepped into the center of the kitchen, and danced. Alone. I didn't care how it looked. My feet remembered the rhythm before my mind did. It was the dance James and I had first shared at the county fair, under the string lights by the cotton candy stand. My shoulders relaxed, my eyes closed. And for those 3 minutes, I wasn't a mother, a widow, a woman who'd almost drowned in heartbreak. I was Maggie Collins, 22, in love with the smell of fried dough and the feel of calloused fingers on her waist. When the song ended, I stood still in the quiet, breathless, and then I laughed. Not the laugh I gave at church to be polite, a real one, from the belly. That afternoon, I pulled down a box of old journals and recipe cards. I started sorting through them, not with the intention to organize, but to rediscover. I found notes I had written to myself over the years. "Try lemon zest in the cornbread. Don't forget to call Sarah on her birthday. You're allowed to rest, Maggie." One note simply said, "You're still here, so live like it." I taped that one to the bathroom mirror. Later that week, Helen invited me to a quilting circle at the library. I nearly said no. I didn't consider myself a quilter, never had the patience. But something in her tone made me pause. "Don't come to sew," she said. "Come to sit. That's half the point." So I did, and I was surprised. The room smelled like fabric and lavender, and a little bit like old paperbacks. There were about 10 women there, most older than me, though not by much. They welcomed me with easy smiles, like I'd always been part of the circle. I didn't quilt that first day. I just listened. They talked about everything. The price of tomatoes, a neighbor's cat that had gone missing, how the new pharmacist was too young to trust but too sweet not to like. And in between, there were stories. Real ones. I was married to a man for 40 years, one woman said, threading her needle, and I didn't learn how to be alone until year 40. My son came out last year, another shared quietly, and I told him I loved him. That was the easy part. The hard part was learning how to love myself for raising him right. We were all carrying something. That's what I learned. And none of us were doing it gracefully all the time, but we were doing it together. I started going every week, and eventually, I picked up a needle. I wasn't good. My stitches were crooked, my fingers too stiff. But there was something holy about pulling thread through fabric, watching pieces come together, pattern by pattern. It felt like mending, even when I was still raw. One evening, as we packed up, a woman named Ruth leaned over and said, "Maggie, I know this is forward, but have you ever considered leading something at the community center? You've got a kindness to you. Folks trust that." I blinked. Me? I wouldn't know what to teach. She smiled. "Doesn't have to be teaching. Just showing up. Maybe call it Wednesday warmth, coffee, conversation, a place for folks to sit and remember they're not invisible." I told her I'd think about it, and I did, all week. The idea nestled into my heart like something meant to be planted. That Sunday, after service, I stayed behind and spoke to Pastor Glenn. "I'd like to try something new," I told him. He smiled the way a man does when he's been waiting for you to find your voice. And so, the next Wednesday, I opened the doors of the community room at 10 a.m. with 2 fresh pots of coffee, a plate of lemon shortbread, and no expectations. 3 people came. Helen, of course. Mr. Banks, the widower who used to run the post office and now spent most of his days reading alone in the park. And, to my surprise, Laney. They sat around the table like it was an old ritual. We talked, we laughed. Mr. Banks told stories from when stamps cost a nickel and you could trust a handshake. Helen corrected his dates with exaggerated scorn. Laney said almost nothing, but she smiled, which was everything. I called it a success. The next week, 5 people came. Then 9. By the 4th Wednesday, we had to borrow chairs from the back closet. I didn't teach anything. I just poured coffee and listened. Sometimes that's all people need, space and warmth and someone who sees them. That night, Danny called, just to talk. "I heard you've become a community leader," he joked. "Hardly," I replied. "I just make good coffee." He was quiet a moment. Then, "I'm proud of you, Mom." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I'm proud of you too," I said. And I meant it. The creek outside whispered beneath the moonlight. And in that sound, I heard not just water, but welcome. A week before Christmas, I found myself standing in the back room of the Asheville thrift shop, holding a faded winter coat that used to belong to James. I hadn't planned on visiting the thrift shop that day. I'd gone to pick up a few extra blankets for the church's cold weather drive, but as I was browsing through the racks, something pulled me toward the donations awaiting processing sign, and before I knew it, I was running my hands over thick corduroy I hadn't touched in nearly 30 years. It was the coat James wore every December, the one with the worn collar and the pocket that always held peppermints. I donated it after he passed, thinking I could live lighter without it. I was wrong. I brought it home, folded it over the back of my favorite chair, let it sit there without apology. That evening, as I drank tea and watched the lights on the tree flicker soft and slow, I thought of the winter James proposed. We were in the parking lot behind Millie's Diner, just 23, bundled in coats too thin for the mountain cold. He didn't have a ring yet, just a promise, and a folded napkin where he'd scribbled the words, "Grow old with me?" We'd laughed, we'd kissed, we'd built a life. And then he left too early, too fast. For years, I pushed those memories away, not because they hurt too much, but because I thought remembering meant holding on too tightly. But that night, as I traced the coat's stitching with my fingers, I realized something. Remembering isn't holding on. It's honoring what carried you here. The next day, I visited the cemetery. I brought James a thermos of black coffee, his favorite, and sat beside his stone for a long time. No flowers, no tears, just stories. I told him about Laney, About Danny. About the quilt I was stitching, crooked lines and all, and how I was thinking of painting the kitchen next spring. And then I whispered something I hadn't said aloud in years. I miss you, but I'm not lost anymore. The wind rustled the dried leaves around my boots, and for a moment, the air felt like breath. That same afternoon, I was surprised by a knock on the door. Laney. But she wasn't alone. A tall woman, with serious eyes and gentle hands, stood beside her Laney's caseworker. Her name was Francine. She introduced herself, then asked, "Would you be willing to speak with the agency about a possible guardianship arrangement?" He blinked. "You mean?" Francine nodded. "Laney turns 17 soon. She's not asking for adoption necessarily, just stability. A place to land, for now. She trusts you." I turned to Laney. Her eyes were hopeful, but cautious, like someone who'd been told no more times than she could count. "I'm not perfect," I said quietly. "I burn biscuits and talk to the creek." Laney smirked. "I know. I'm not trying to replace your mom. I know that too." I stepped aside. "Then come in. It's cold out." That evening, I made chili. We sat at the table, me, Laney, and Francine, and filled out the paperwork. Not everything was official yet, but it felt right, like setting a plate at the table that had always been waiting. Later, when the house grew quiet and Laney had gone to bed, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders and whispered into the dark, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular. Just to the night, the creek, God maybe. Because somehow, in all the breaking, something beautiful had found its way in. Laney had a quiet way of moving through the house, like someone who didn't want to be caught needing too much. She unpacked her few things without a word, folding jeans into neat little stacks, lining up her shoes against the far wall of the guest room as though she wasn't sure how long she'd be allowed to stay. I didn't press her. I let her settle like rain into thirsty soil. She didn't say much that first week, and I didn't fill the silence either. Some nights, we ate in near quiet, only the sound of spoons against bowls, the occasional clink of a glass. But there was no tension, only space, the kind that allows a wound to breathe. On the third evening, she found me in the living room, untangling Christmas lights with a look on my face that probably said I'd rather be doing anything else. "You want help?" she asked. I blinked, then smiled. "I was hoping you'd ask." We sat on the floor together, light strands stretched between us. She was better at the knots than I was patient fingers, sharp eyes. As she worked, I asked, "You ever have a real Christmas tree before?" She shrugged. "There was one in a group home once. Plastic. Someone knocked it over during a fight." "Well," I said, "we're going to do better this year." The next morning, we bundled up and drove out to the edge of town, where the Nicholson farms set up their tree lot each December. Laney walked between the rows with something like awe in her eyes, not big, dramatic wonder, but the kind that comes when someone's seeing a thing they thought only existed in movies. "This one," she said, stopping beside a tall, slightly lopsided tree. "You sure?" I asked. "He's a bit uneven." "So am I," she replied. We brought it home. She helped me set it in the stand. We trimmed it together, one ornament at a time. She found the old one Danny made in first grade, the one shaped like a snowman with 3 lopsided buttons and a smudge of glitter that never quite stayed put. "He made this?" she asked, holding it delicately. I nodded. He was a handful. Sweet, though. She didn't press for more. That night, after the lights were on and the room glowed in soft amber, Laney curled up in the armchair beside the tree with a book I didn't recognize. I sat across from her, knitting a few crooked rows into the blanket I'd been working on since fall. There was something sacred about the silence we shared. Not empty. Full. Later, as I turned off the kitchen light, I glanced at the plate on the counter. 2 sugar cookies, one half-eaten. Laney had baked them that afternoon while I was out. She'd left a note beside them. "I used your recipe. Hope that's okay." I smiled, tucked the note into the recipe box like it was something precious. A few days before Christmas, I got a call. "Danny." "Hey, Mom," he said. His voice was soft, steady. "Hi, honey. I was wondering if I could stop by. I've got something for you." "And for Laney." I paused. "You've met?" "Only once," he said. "At the community center. She helped me fix a jammed paper tray in the printer. Didn't say much, but she looked steady, like someone who meant what she said. I smiled. She's that kind of girl. Would it be okay? I looked at the clock. Dinner's at 6. He came right on time. Laney was in the kitchen, setting the table, when he walked in. She froze for half a second, then nodded at him. Hey. Danny nodded back. Hey. They didn't shake hands, didn't hug, but they moved around each other with a quiet sort of grace, like people who understood the weight of silence. Dinner was baked chicken, rosemary potatoes, and green beans with bacon. Simple, familiar. We talked about the weather, the town's winter carnival, Helen's attempts to convince the library to host poetry readings again. Danny listened more than he spoke. Laney did the same. After we cleared the dishes, Danny pulled a small package from his coat pocket. It's not much, he said. Just something I found at the flea market. Thought of you, Mom. I opened it carefully. Inside was a tiny ceramic cardinal, the kind you might set on a windowsill. Its red glaze was chipped at the wing, but its eyes were still bright. You used to say they were little messengers, he said, from the folks we miss. I still do, I whispered. He handed Laney a second package. She blinked, surprised, then opened it slowly. A pair of fingerless gloves, handmade, knit in a deep navy blue. They're a little rough, Danny said. First pair I've tried, but the yarn's warm. Laney slid them on. They fit. Good, he said. You've got work to do. Can't let cold fingers slow you down. Something shifted in her face then, a kind of softening. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. After he left, Laney stood by the door for a while, holding the gloves in her hands like they meant more than warmth. He's not what I expected, she said quietly. He wasn't always what I expected either, I replied. Then she said, I think he's trying. I nodded. So do I. Christmas Eve arrived with snow in the forecast. I baked gingerbread and hung a wreath on the front door. Laney helped me wrap last-minute gifts, careful, tidy hands, paper folded sharp as corners in a hospital bed. That night, we went to midnight service. Laney wore a dress she found in the back of my closet. It had been mine once, a soft burgundy thing with sleeves that fluttered at the wrist. She looked beautiful, not in a polished way, in a whole way. The sanctuary was full of candlelight and hymns. When we sang Silent Night, I glanced over and saw Laney mouthing the words, eyes closed. Her lips trembled, just slightly. Afterward, we walked home under stars. It's not perfect, she said suddenly, snow crunching under her boots. This life. No, I replied. It's not, but it's better than before. I reached for her hand. She let me take it. And in that quiet, cold night, I felt the warmth of something not just returning, but becoming. The morning after Christmas was quiet in that rare, golden way, the house wrapped in leftover cinnamon and pine needles, soft daylight filtering through the curtains like grace. Laney was still asleep upstairs, and I let her stay wrapped in dreams. She'd laughed the night before, not just smiled, laughed. And it was the kind of sound that made a person believe in second chances. I sat at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee, flipping through a seed catalog Helen had brought by earlier in the week. She circled things she thought I might like. You need color this spring, she'd said. All that healing in your heart deserves blossoms. I was halfway through the page on heirloom tomatoes when there was a knock at the door. Not many folks came calling the day after Christmas. I expected it to be Helen with her leftover ham and unsolicited wisdom, but it wasn't. It was a man I didn't recognize. He looked to be around my age, mid-60s, maybe a touch younger, broad-shouldered silver hair pulled back into a short, neat ponytail, wearing a heavy brown coat that looked worn but well-kept. His boots were dusted with snow. In his hands, he held a book. Morning, he said with a smile that was kind but not presumptuous. Are you Margaret Collins? I nodded, cautious but not afraid. Most folks just call me Maggie. He nodded. I'm Raymond Harper. I'm with the Historical Society. I believe you donated a few books last year from your husband's collection? I blinked, thinking back. Yes, several of James's old field guides and journals. He held up the book. Well, this one got shelved late by mistake. It has his notes inside margin scribbles about bird migration, but there's also a letter tucked in the back, addressed to you. We figured it might be personal." End quote. I took the book from him carefully, my fingers suddenly cold against the leather spine. I didn't speak right away. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced," he added gently. "But I live out past the ridge, and I figured a face-to-face return felt more respectful." "Thank you," I said finally. "Would you like some coffee?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, if it's not too much trouble." We stepped into the kitchen. I poured him a mug, slid over the honey and cream, and gestured toward the seat across from me. Ray looked around the room, his gaze thoughtful but not nosy. "Your husband was a good note-taker," he said. "Passionate. He had a way of describing birds like they were old friends." "He was," I replied, thumbing through the book. "He had this quiet fascination with flight. Said watching birds was the closest he got to understanding freedom." Ray smiled. "I like that, and..." We sipped in silence for a few minutes. Then he stood. "Well, I should let you get back to your morning. Just thought you'd want the book in hand before the new year." "Wait," I said, setting down my cup. "Would you like a piece of cranberry bread? Still fresh." He smiled. I'd be a fool to say no. So he stayed. Just for a slice. But we talked about books, about Asheville before it got touristy, about the old train depot they were trying to restore. He had an easy manner, like someone who'd walked through his share of storms and learned how to keep his coat dry without losing his heart. When he finally stood to leave, he said, "If you ever want to see the depot restoration, I'd be happy to show you around. It's a mess, but it's honest work. And sometimes old places just need someone to believe they're worth saving." I nodded, heart unexpectedly full. "Sounds familiar." After he left, I sat back down and opened the book. Tucked in the back cover, behind a page dog-eared and worn thin, was a small, folded letter. It was James's handwriting. "Madge, if you're reading this, it means the world kept turning without me. I hope it's been kind to you. I hope you still sing while you cook and curse under your breath when the faucet leaks. I never said it enough, but you were my whole world. And if you're holding this letter, it means I didn't get to grow old with you the way I promised in that diner parking lot. But I want you to know this. I never wanted your life to stop because mine did. Love again, if it comes. Laugh again, dance again. Don't let the grief I left you with become your shadow. Let it be your teacher. I loved you then. I love you still. Always. Jay." The tears came slow, then fast. But they weren't bitter. They were soft, cleansing. That evening, when Laney came downstairs, I had already baked another loaf of bread and pulled the heavy wool blanket off the guest bed to watch the snow from the porch. She sat beside me without a word. After a while, I said, "Did you know birds don't sing because they're happy?" Laney raised an eyebrow. "They sing because they have to. It's how they claim their space in the world, how they say, 'I'm still here.'" Laney leaned her head against my shoulder. "I like that," she said, and in the quiet that followed, I thought, "So do I." January came with a hush, the kind of hush that settles over hills blanketed in snow, over porches that creak under the weight of time, and over hearts that have finally grown quiet enough to listen. Laney's presence in the house had become something steady. Not loud, not needy, just there. Like a warm light left on in the hallway. She started helping with the morning chores without being asked. Folding towels, sweeping the porch, writing little notes on the grocery list like, "Get more of that good hot chocolate." I was still learning how to let someone in without trying to fix them. And she was learning how to stay in one place without feeling the urge to run. One morning, I found her in the living room, staring at the wall where I kept old pictures. She was looking at one in particular, James in his army uniform, holding baby Danny in one arm and a homemade "Welcome Home" sign in the other. "He looks strong," she said. "He was," I replied, stepping beside her. "But soft too," he cried when Danny started school. Laney nodded, thoughtful. "I think people forget men are allowed to do both." I looked at her, surprised by the depth in her voice. "So do I said. Later that day, I drove her to her counseling session in town. On the way back, we stopped by the community center. She'd begun volunteering on Saturdays, helping the younger kids with crafts, reading stories out loud, even though her voice still trembled when too many eyes were on her. While she was inside, I sat in the truck with the heater running, flipping through a library book and watching snow melt slowly on the windshield. Then I saw him. Ray. He was walking across the parking lot, arms full of blueprints, scarf tossed over one shoulder like he was in a hurry but too polite to show it. He noticed me, paused, then knocked gently on the window. I rolled it down. "Well, look who braved the cold," he said, smiling. "It was either this or reorganize my spice rack," I joked. "Both noble pursuits," he said, then nodded toward the center. "Laney's doing good work in there." "She is," I said. "More than she knows." Ham. He leaned against the truck for a moment, snowflakes gathering on his shoulders. "I've been meaning to ask. There's a lecture next week on Appalachian folk songs. Nothing fancy, just stories set to strings. You ever been to one?" I shook my head. "I haven't." "Well, if you're free, I'd be honored to save you a seat." There was something about the way he asked, not pressing, not desperate, just open. I nodded. "I'd like that." "Offses." He smiled, tipped his hat like something out of another time, and walked off. That night, I told Laney about the invitation. She didn't tease, she didn't smirk. She just looked at me and said, "I hope you go." I stared into my cup of tea for a moment. "Do you think that would be strange, after everything?" Laney shrugged. "I think letting yourself be seen again isn't strange. It's brave." And so I went. The auditorium wasn't crowded, just a few rows of folks bundled in scarves and curiosity. Ray was waiting, 2 seats in from the aisle, a thermos of something warm resting on the floor between his boots. "Saved the best spot," he said as I sat beside him. The music was simple, just a banjo, a guitar, and an old dulcimer that sounded like rain on a tin roof. But the songs were rich with story. Ballads about lost love, hard winters, and small hopes that refused to die. Halfway through, they played a song about a woman waiting for her husband who never returned from war. The lyrics were soft, but the ache was sharp. I felt Ray glance at me. "I'm okay," I whispered. And I was. When the evening ended, we walked to the parking lot under a sky full of stars. He didn't try to take my hand, but he walked close, our steps slow, as if neither of us wanted to rush back into the world just yet. At my truck, I turned to him. "Thank you. For the invitation. For all of it." He nodded. "Thank you for saying yes." I drove home with the music still playing in my head, like a thread connecting me to something older, deeper, and still alive. Laney was asleep when I got in, but on the counter, I found a mug washed and dried, and beside it, a note in her careful handwriting. "Hope it was a good night. You deserve one." I smiled, tucked the note into my recipe box with the others. Before going to bed, I stood by the window, looking out at the yard, the trees, the creek just beyond. So much had changed, and yet, the heart of things, the good, the broken, the becoming, was still the same. We were still here, still moving, still singing. February arrived with its usual quiet insistence. Snow still clung to the shadows, but here and there, hints of thaw began to whisper through the soil. The creek, long muffled under frost, began to murmur again, not loudly, but persistently. Like it had something to say, if only I'd listened close enough. Laney had started a journal. I didn't ask to read it, but I saw her scribbling most nights, sitting cross-legged in her bed with the little lamp turned low. Sometimes she'd tear out a page, fold it into a tiny square, and tuck it into the pocket of her coat. I don't know if those were thoughts too private to keep or too sacred to leave behind. Either way, I let her have that space. One Saturday morning, I found Danny waiting on the porch. He didn't knock, just sat there on the old swing, hands in his lap, coat zipped to his chin like the cold had something personal against him. I opened the door, surprised but not startled. "Morning," I said. He looked up, didn't want to wake Laney. "She sleeps like a log," I replied, stepping out with a blanket over my shoulders. "You hungry?" He shook his head. "Just wanted to talk, if that's okay." We sat side by side. I poured 2 cups of coffee from the thermos. I always kept warm on weekends. We held them like anchors. Danny cleared his throat. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About that day at the creek. About everything." I said nothing. I'd learned silence sometimes gave people room to tell the truth. He took a sip, then said, "I've gone back there. A few times. Walked the path. stood at the same spot, tried to understand how I let myself get there, end quote. I nodded slowly. And I still don't have a good answer. But I think I was trying to make sense of failure by controlling something. Anything. Even if it was the worst choice imaginable. He looked at me then, really looked. And I can't undo it, Mom. I know that. I wake up some nights thinking about it, and wish I could swap places with the man I used to be. But that man was selfish, afraid, and he hurt the only person who ever stayed. How? A long silence passed between us, not cold, but weighted. I forgive you, Danny, I said finally. Not because I forget, not because what happened didn't cut deep, but because I can't live in that shadow forever, and neither can you. His shoulders shook then, not a sob, just a release. A man breaking in all the right places so he could grow back stronger. I'm working at the co-op now, he said after a while, fixing up old tools, teaching some of the younger guys basic repairs, end quote. That sounds like you. He chuckled. Yeah, well, I'm trying to do more listening than talking. That also sounds like you if you were someone else, I teased. We both laughed. And it was real. Tentative but real. He turned serious again. Laney's good for you. She's good for herself, I replied, but I'm proud to walk alongside her. Danny nodded. I brought something. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden box, the kind you might find at a flea market, hand-carved, smooth. Inside, nestled in cloth, was a necklace, a delicate chain with a tiny silver feather charm. It's not much, he said, but I saw it and thought, maybe you'd like something light to wear again, not heavy like the cross I gave you as a kid. I held the feather in my hand. It shimmered faintly in the winter sun. It's beautiful. He looked away. I've been trying to carry things lighter, too. When he left, I didn't watch from the window like before. I simply sat on the swing, the feather resting against my palm, the creek singing low in the distance. That night, I told Laney about our conversation. She was silent for a long moment, then said, He's doing the work. That matters. I looked at her. You speak like someone who's done some, too. She shrugged. Maybe. Then she surprised me. Can I call you something different? He blinked. Different how? She hesitated. Not Mom. I'm not there yet. But maybe Maggie doesn't feel like enough anymore. My throat tightened. What did you have in mind? She smiled, shy but sure. Mag, like soft, strong, not perfect, but home. I laughed, soft, deep. Then Mag it is. She nodded. Night, Mag. Good night, sweetheart. And when she went upstairs, I stood alone in the kitchen, the feather necklace now resting just above my collarbone. I reached up, touched it gently, and whispered, I'm still here, honestly. And for the first time in a long while, it didn't sound like a promise I had to keep for others. It sounded like one I could keep for myself. March brought with it the first brave buds of spring tiny things, barely visible unless you were looking for them. But I'd learned how to watch closely again. Laney and I started planting nothing fancy, just a few herbs in terracotta pots on the kitchen windowsill. Basil, thyme, and lavender. She picked lavender because she liked the way the name sounded. It smells like peace, she said. I smiled. Then we'll grow peace right here. One Saturday morning, as we sat on the porch sipping tea, Laney asked something unexpected. You ever think about leaving this town? I looked at her, surprised. Leaving? Asheville? She shrugged. Not forever, just to see something different. I stared out toward the hills. I hadn't thought about leaving in years. The house was full of history, James, Danny, even the ghosts of birthdays and burnt casseroles. But something in me stirred at the idea. Not because I wanted to run, but because for the first time in a long while, I wondered if I could still be more than what I'd already been. That same week, Ray came by. It wasn't unannounced, but it wasn't planned either. He had a habit now of stopping by with something small in hand. A book, a thermos of cider, a postcard from a trip he once took with his late sister to the coast. This time, it was a flyer. Thought of you, he said, handing it to me. It was for a week-long retreat at a folk arts center a few towns over. Storytelling, quilting, music, baking, gardening, it read. A gathering for those who've lived long enough to have something to say. I chuckled. You think I've lived long enough? I think you've lived well enough, he replied. I looked at the dates. It was in April, not far. But it meant being away. It meant letting go of control, of routine, even of Laney for a few days. Ray must have seen the hesitation in my eyes. You don't have to say yes. Just think about it. I nodded. I will. Later that night, I brought it up to Laney. I expected resistance, maybe even worry. But she surprised me again. You should go, she said. You've spent your whole life staying for everyone else. Maybe it's time you went somewhere just for you. I laughed. And what will you do while I'm off gallivanting with other quilt-loving grandmas? She smirked. Probably steal your tea, and maybe call Danny if I burn the kitchen down. We both knew she wouldn't. Still, I called Danny that evening. I think I'm going to leave you with Laney for a week. He laughed. Should I be scared? Only if you forget she's smarter than both of us combined. He promised to check in daily, to make sure she got to school, that the garden didn't dry up, and that he'd fix the squeaky stair while I was gone. I registered the next morning. The retreat center sat on a ridge just outside the town of Black Mountain. When I arrived, the hills were dotted with dogwoods in bloom, their petals like tiny handkerchiefs waving from the trees. My room was simple wooden bed frame, floral quilt, a desk overlooking the valley. I unpacked slowly, unsure how to be a guest in a life that wasn't mine. But by the second day, I was laughing with strangers over biscuits and jam, trading stories like they were currency. There was an older woman named Martha who taught me how to make buttermilk soap, a retired postal worker named Ed who played banjo like he was born doing it, and a widowed nurse named Carol who shared poems she'd never shown anyone before. And I shared too. I told them about James, about the creek, about Danny, and the day I chose love over punishment, about Laney, and how healing sometimes looks like baking cornbread with the radio on. One evening, during the last circle gathering, we were asked to tell a single truth we'd learned in our lives. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, hands clasped. I've learned, I said, that you don't stop becoming just because life tries to break you. You keep becoming. Every morning you choose grace over bitterness. Every time you forgive someone who didn't deserve it. Every time you plant something hope, herbs, or just a kind word you are becoming. The room was quiet, but warm. When I returned home a few days later, the porch light was on. Laney met me at the door with a tight hug and an exaggerated sniff. You smell like lavender and biscuits. I smiled. That's about right. The house was still standing. The garden was watered. Danny had left a note that said, "Squeaky stair now, just a quiet one." And on the kitchen table was a small vase with a single daffodil and a card that read, "Welcome home, Mag. We missed your stories." That night, as I unpacked, I found a small square of paper folded in my suitcase. It was from Ray. In it, he'd written, "You've lived many lives already, Maggie Collins, but I hope you know it's never too late to start another." And in the corner, just beneath his name, he'd drawn a tiny feather. April gave way to May like a curtain lifting on a new act. The dogwoods had dropped their last blossoms, and now everything was green and bright and full of purpose. The kind of air that makes you want to plant something, fix something, or just sit quietly and be glad you didn't give up. The Wednesday warmth group at the community center had grown beyond what I ever imagined. We'd outgrown the folding table. Helen had to bring chairs from her garage. We started rotating who brought the coffee cake. Ruth's was always the best, though no one said it out loud. Laney helped organize a shelf of donated books in the corner. People had started leaving behind poems, notes, even recipes for others to find. It had become more than a gathering. It was a living thing stitched together by presence, kindness, and the quiet grace of ordinary folks showing up. One afternoon, Danny showed up early. He didn't say much, just walked around the room, nodding at people, helping Mr. Banks hang a new corkboard on the back wall. Later, as we were sweeping up, he came to me and said, "You made something here." I paused, looking around. "We did." He nodded. "You were right, you know, about love and money not weighing the same. End of trust." I raised an eyebrow. "And what's heavier?" He smiled. "Love, but it's worth carrying." I reached up, touched his cheek. "You're doing good, Danny." He took a breath. I've been thinking of applying to the community college, just to take a few courses, trade skills, counseling, maybe even some writing. I grinned. I'd love to read something you wrote. You already have, he said, pulling out a folded piece of paper from his coat. Wrote this at the center last week. End. I opened it slowly. It was a short letter, part confession, part gratitude, part prayer. It didn't try to be poetic. It just told the truth. At the bottom, he'd signed it. From the son who almost got lost, but found his way back because you didn't stop believing in maps. I folded it carefully, tucked it into my purse like a treasure. That night, I sat on the porch with Laney. The sky was soft with stars. The kind that don't demand attention, but are always there if you take the time to look. She leaned her head against my shoulder. Did you ever think we'd end up here? She asked. Not exactly, I said, but I hoped. She was quiet a moment. Then, they offered me a summer internship at the library, youth reading programs. They said I have a way with the little ones. You do, I said. They want to put me on the flyer, she added. My picture, my story, not the hard parts, but the part where I stayed. I smiled. You earned that. She looked up at me. Would it be weird if I said yes? Not weird, I said. Brave. She took a deep breath. Then I guess I'm brave. I wrapped an arm around her, pulled her close. You always were. A week later, Ray invited us both to the depot reopening. The old train station had been transformed, wooden benches restored, brick walls scrubbed clean, a little exhibit in the corner, with stories of local families who had built the town. He'd included James, and me, and even Laney. We're part of this place now, he said, showing us a plaque with our names etched into brass. The storytellers, the ones who stayed, the ones who rebuilt. Laney reached out and ran her fingers over her name. I never thought I'd see my name on a wall for something good. You didn't just end up here, Ray said. You chose it. That evening, as we sat around a bonfire outside the depot with music playing and children chasing fireflies in the grass, Ray handed me a small box. I didn't mean this to be formal, he said quickly, but I wanted you to have it. Inside was a locket. Not gold, not expensive, just simple silver, etched with the outline of a feather. Inside, on one side, was a tiny photo of a cardinal. On the other, a quote in small script. You're still becoming. I looked up at him, eyes full. Ray, no rush, he said gently. I'm not trying to fit into anyone's old story, but I'd like to be part of the new one. If there's room. I took his hand. There is. Laney watched us from across the fire, a soft grin on her face. That night, we walked home under a sky wide with stars. The creek sang beside us, not warning this time but celebrating, and I whispered to the dark, like a secret I'd finally learned how to say, I am still becoming. And this time, it was not a hope. It was a truth. I used to think stories ended with answers. But now, I know better. Some stories don't end at all. They unfold. They stretch across years and people and porches and places where the light hits just right. They whisper instead of shout. And if you're lucky, you get to live long enough to understand the difference. It's been nearly a year since the day Danny took my arm on that trail and tried to rewrite both our lives in a moment of fear. I've told the story 100 times in my mind. Not because I want to relive it, but because it reminds me how far we've come. How far I've come. Danny still stops by the house every Sunday afternoon. He brings whatever he's baked that week he's gotten good with scones. Lemon poppy seeds, my favorite. He's halfway through his second semester at the community college, helping lead a peer support group for students who've messed up but want to make it right, as he puts it. He and Laney have a quiet, steady bond. They're not close like siblings, not distant like strangers. Just two people who met at a broken place and decided not to leave each other there. Laney starts her senior year this fall. She wants to study early childhood education. Says she wants to teach kids how to read and how to feel safe. She's already helped 3 of the kids at the center write their first poems. I keep them on my fridge. She calls me Mag most days. Sometimes Magpie when she's teasing. I call her home. Ray comes by on Thursdays. Always with something in hand. Always with something kind to say. We haven't rushed things. We don't need to. We go slow. We walk together. We build little things, bookshelves, raised garden beds, trust. He never tries to replace the love I had with James. He just honors it by standing beside what remains and helping it bloom again. The Wednesday warmth circle is now too big for one room. We moved it to the back hall of the church, where the windows are tall and the coffee flows a little stronger. New people show up every month. Some stay, some just come once. But all of them leave a little something behind. A story, a joke, a casserole recipe that no one can quite replicate. And me? I've kept becoming. I still talk to the creek. I still burn the biscuits sometimes. I still cry when a song hits too close. But I also laugh louder now. I plant things without worrying if they'll grow. I wear the feather necklace most days. And I keep the letter James wrote in the book about birds tucked into my nightstand drawer because some promises aren't about time. They're about love. Real. Enduring. Choosing it, everyday love. And if there's one thing I've learned, the kind of truth that earns its place in your bones, it's this. You are allowed to begin again. At any age, after any heartbreak. You are allowed to be soft and strong, to let go without forgetting, to forgive without erasing, to build a life that is no longer defined by who left or what broke, but by who stayed and what grew. So if you're listening to this, maybe with your own ache, your own regret, your own quietly blooming hope, know this. You are still becoming, and becoming is the most beautiful thing we ever get to do. What did you feel while listening to this story all the way through? If it touched your heart, leave the number 1 inch the comments. If you didn't feel connected to it, feel free to write 0. Every piece of feedback means a lot to me, because it's thanks to you that I can keep going. It's from your responses that I draw the energy to tell the next chapter a new story is coming, even deeper, even more moving, and I truly hope you'll be there to listen with me.